Houston, we have a problem. These 6 simple words, spoken by astronaut Jack Swigert, were the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong aboard Apollo 13. At that moment, the crew of 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, found themselves in a life-or-death situation, hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth. They were on a mission to the moon full of hope and excitement when disaster struck. What was supposed to be a routine spaceflight suddenly became a fight for survival. An oxygen tank had exploded, and their spacecraft was crippled. Power was fading, vital systems were failing, and the crew's chances of returning home were becoming slim. Mission Control in Houston scrambled to understand what had happened. Engineers and experts on Earth raced against the clock to find solutions, while the astronauts worked with limited resources, trying to keep themselves alive. In those tense moments, the world watched in shock and fear, wondering if the crew would ever make it back. The Apollo 13 mission quickly shifted from an exploration of the moon to one of the most incredible rescue efforts in history. This is their story, a story of human courage, ingenuity, and the will to survive against impossible odds. In April 1970, Apollo 13 was ready to make history. It was supposed to be NASA's 3rd mission to land humans on the moon. The crew was excited and confident, prepared for what they thought would be a successful journey. Commander Jim Lovell, Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes, and Command Module pilot Jack Swigert had trained hard for this moment. They knew their spacecraft inside and out. The world was watching as Apollo 13 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on April 11, 1970. People were eager to see another moon landing after the excitement of Apollo 11 and 12. Everything seemed perfect, the launch went smoothly, and the spacecraft was performing just as expected. For NASA, this was a routine mission. For the astronauts, it was another step in humanity's journey to explore the moon. But as they would soon discover, fate had other plans. The Apollo 13 mission was in the hands of 3 astronauts, each bringing their own expertise and experience. Jim Lovell, the commander, was no stranger to space. This was his 4th mission, making him one of NASA's most experienced astronauts. Calm under pressure, and with a wealth of knowledge, he was the leader who would guide the crew through their journey. Then there was Jack Swigert, the Command Module pilot. He wasn't supposed to be on this mission at all. Originally, Ken Mattingly was set to fly, but days before the launch, Mattingly was exposed to German measles. Swigert was brought in as a last-minute replacement. Despite the sudden change, Swigert was more than capable, having trained hard for this role. Finally, Fred Hayes, the Lunar Module pilot, was ready to walk on the moon. It was Hayes' first trip to space, but his training and engineering background made him a key part of the team. Together, these 3 men represented the best of NASA's space program. They were well prepared, skilled, and eager to succeed. On April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The world watched as the spacecraft shot into the sky, leaving behind a trail of fire and smoke. Everything was going smoothly. The crew felt the familiar rumble of the rocket engines, and within minutes, they were in space, on their way to the moon. The launch was flawless, the spacecraft was working perfectly, and the team was in high spirits. From the outside, it seemed like another successful mission to the moon. The crew carried out their tasks and prepared for the days ahead, confident that they would soon be walking on the lunar surface. But just 2 days into the mission, everything would change. 2 days into the mission, everything seemed to be going well. The crew was going through their normal routines when a small issue caught their attention. It wasn't anything alarming at first, a minor technical glitch that didn't seem like a big deal. They reported it to Mission Control, and it appeared to be under control. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of something far worse. On April 13, 1970, the crew performed a routine procedure to stir the oxygen tanks. It was something they had done many times before, but this time something went horribly wrong. A sudden explosion rocked the spacecraft. One of the oxygen tanks in the service module had burst, sending the crew into immediate crisis mode. In an instant, the Apollo 13 mission was no longer about landing on the moon. The explosion caused a loss of power and crippled the spacecraft's systems. The crew could feel the danger lights were flickering, alarms were going off, and the air was filled with a sense of uncertainty. What had started as a casual task turned into a life-threatening disaster in the blink of an eye. Jack Swigert's voice came over the radio Houston. We have a problem. Those words were simple but signaled the gravity of the situation. Mission Control on Earth scrambled to understand what had happened. and the crew realized that their mission had changed. Getting to the moon was no longer the priority. Surviving and finding a way back to Earth became the focus. The spacecraft was critically damaged. Power was draining fast, oxygen was leaking, and the crew had limited time to figure out their next steps. It was clear the mission was now a race against time, and bringing the crew home alive was the only goal. With the command module severely damaged by the explosion, the crew had no choice but to rely on the lunar module, an entirely different part of the spacecraft. It was originally designed to land on the moon, not to keep 3 astronauts alive in deep space. But now it became their lifeboat. The lunar module was small, cramped, and not built for long-term survival, but it was their only hope. The crew quickly transferred into the lunar module, knowing that it would have to keep them alive until they could find a way back to Earth. It was a fragile safety net in the middle of a vast, unforgiving space. The situation grew even more desperate as they realized the lunar module wasn't equipped to support 3 men for an extended period. It was meant for only 2 astronauts, and for a much shorter time. Resources were running low. Oxygen, water, and power had to be rationed carefully. They had limited power to run critical systems, and each breath they took used up precious oxygen. The crew had to turn off everything that wasn't absolutely necessary, plunging them into freezing cold temperatures to conserve energy. Every drop of water and every bit of power became a lifeline, and they knew they had to make it last for the long journey home. In the face of overwhelming odds, the Apollo 13 crew remained calm. Commander Jim Lovell's leadership was crucial. He knew panic could be deadly. Together with Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert, they leaned on their training and focused on the task at hand. They couldn't afford to give in to fear. Back on Earth, Mission Control was working around the clock, trying to figure out how to bring the astronauts home safely. Communication between the ground crew and the astronauts was vital. Every decision was a race against time, but the crew's determination never wavered. They fought against the rising panic, focusing instead on the steps needed to survive and return home alive. While the astronauts struggled in space, NASA's Mission Control back on Earth was working around the clock. In Houston, a team of engineers, scientists, and experts scrambled to find solutions to problems no one had ever anticipated. With the spacecraft badly damaged, they had to think creatively, using whatever tools and resources were available to keep the crew alive. The pressure was immense, but the dedication of the team on the ground never wavered. They were determined to bring the astronauts home. As time passed, a new, silent danger emerged: carbon dioxide. With the spacecraft's life support systems damaged, carbon dioxide levels inside the lunar module started to rise dangerously high. The astronauts had enough oxygen to breathe, but the buildup of CO2 was slowly poisoning the air. If a solution wasn't found soon, the crew would suffocate. Mission Control knew they had to act quickly to solve this life-threatening problem. NASA's engineers came up with a risky but brilliant idea. Using only the materials available on the spacecraft, things like duct tape, plastic bags, and the square filters from the command module, they created a makeshift air filter. It was a jury-rigged solution that had to work. The astronauts followed the instructions carefully, piecing together this improvised filter. Miraculously, it worked. The CO2 levels began to drop, giving the crew a fighting chance. This creative, last-minute fix was a true lifesaver. The problems didn't end there. With the spacecraft's guidance system damaged, the astronauts couldn't rely on their computers to navigate the way home. Jim Lovell had to manually adjust the spacecraft's trajectory, a task that required incredible precision. Without modern instruments, Lovell had to use the stars and the sun to guide the spacecraft. It was an almost impossible task, but with steady hands and nerves of steel, Lovell managed to adjust their course, inching them closer to Earth. As they approached Earth, the crew knew the final, most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. Re-entry into Earth's atmosphere was always risky, but with their command module damaged, the stakes were even higher. The heat shield had to hold up against the intense heat of re-entry, and the command module had to stay intact. No one knew for sure if the spacecraft would survive the plunge through the atmosphere. The astronauts prepared themselves for the worst, but hoped that, after everything they had been through, they would make it home safely. As Apollo 13 entered Earth's atmosphere, communication with Mission Control was cut off, as expected. This blackout period happens with every re-entry, but this time it felt different. Usually it lasted about 3 minutes, but as time stretched on, there was no word from the crew. The world held its breath, fearing the worst. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Everyone waited in silence, wondering if the crew had survived or if the damaged spacecraft had failed them at the last moment. Finally, after 142 intense hours in space, the radio crackled to life. Apollo 13 had re-entered safely. On April 17, 1970, the spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. Rescue teams were quickly dispatched, and the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Against all odds, the crew had made it home alive. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert were safe, and their families, along with people around the world, celebrated their return. It was a moment of triumph after days of uncertainty and fear. Once the crew was safely back on Earth, NASA began investigating what had gone wrong. The cause of the explosion was traced back to a faulty wire inside the oxygen tank. A simple malfunction had nearly cost 3 astronauts their lives. NASA took the findings seriously, implementing new safety measures and procedures to ensure such a disaster would never happen again. The lessons learned from Apollo 13 shaped future space missions and made space travel safer for the astronauts who followed. Apollo 13 became known as NASA's successful failure, although the crew never made it to the moon. Their survival and safe return to Earth became one of the greatest stories of human perseverance. The mission showcased the strength of human ingenuity, teamwork, and resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. It inspired future generations to dream big and to never give up, no matter how tough the odds. The story of Apollo 13 is not just about a mission that went wrong, it's about the incredible determination of the people involved. It's about how humans can come together, think creatively, and fight for survival even in the darkest moments. The courage of the Apollo 13 crew and the brilliance of NASA's ground control remind us of what we can achieve when we refuse to give up. It's a story that continues to inspire, showing the world that even in the face of disaster, we can find a way to succeed. And with that said, thanks for watching True Stories. If this tale of mystery and superstition caught your interest, hit that subscribe button to join us for more fascinating stories from history's strangest corners. Until next time, stay curious.